right now we're in introduction, and I just wanted to take 2 minutes to talk about the name of the study. For a second, the deep end. I was thinking about this week, why I originally named it the deep end. Um, Obviously, the deep end has a connotation of I want to go deep, right? I want to sort of dive deep. I want to submerge myself in content that is enriching to me and things like that. But I also think a little bit about when you're a kid and you're swimming in a swimming pool. The deep end as a kid is the place that you want to go, but you're scared to go to the deep end, right? It's a scary proposition to go where you've never been before, right? Also, once someone has led you into the deep end, um, well, I was gonna say, yeah, you can't get out. No, there's no escape. No, I was going to say, it's your job to play in the deep end, right? You're not just gonna go limp when you're there. And so I'm not ever going to be able to say all that there is to be said, and that needs to be said when we're here. Does that make sense? You can just imagine me leading you there. That's my goal, to the deep end of the pool, but you get to swim around and play. Does that make sense? And that includes even like during our meetings. Like it'd be great if something is confusing, stop everything and just you don't even have to raise your hand. Like this isn't school. Just shout out like let's start talking about what's confusing. Does that make sense? Um, that's number one goal is that you guys are be able to feel more equipped to like be able to like read the deeper things, engage in more. I think like Patricia here is a great example of that. Of every time I'd recommend a book, she'd go out and buy it. And then she'd be like, come back 2 weeks later and she's like, I read that book. You know what I mean? And I'm like, wow, you're just like, you're all in. So yeah, exactly. Does that make sense, guys? Like helping you feel equipped.
Once you go to the deep end, it's like, and you learn different things, and you know that it's true. You can't go back to the place where you were.
Yeah, you can't go without knowledge. That's true. Yeah, no, absolutely.
I mean, it's like,
Yeah, no, it is true. And again, like we're never going to reach the bottom of that pool, that metaphorical pool, right? So it's your job to keep swimming. Okay? Does that make sense? Just keep swimming. Just keep swimming. Okay. So today we're talking about Introduction to Genesis. This is one of those situations where Genesis is, like I said, like I was talking about Ezekiel, it's a wacky, especially Genesis, the first 11 chapters. It's a wacky part of the Bible. And I don't mean that in any derogatory way. It's one of my favorite sections of the Bible. But a lot of people will avoid it or they don't really understand it. It's hard for them to discern what's actually going on in those chapters. Honestly, I have find that people who read cover to cover, they almost forget about it. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, I got through that part. I got through the slog of that. Now I'm getting into maybe some things I can understand. And so the thing about Genesis 1 to 11 that I'm trying to do is help you understand that it is the foundation. Yeah. And it is the most important, like you should prioritize your understanding of Genesis 1 to 11 because that will open up a world of understanding. Does that make sense? Those first 11 chapters are so important. Okay. So before we get into that, like I wouldn't necessarily have to do this or feel the need to do this if we were just starting with Abraham per se, or just starting. But because the Bible starts at the beginning, we need to like prep our minds essentially for the beginning. And I talked last week about marinating our brains in ancient worldview, right? That's hopefully what we're accomplishing part of that today. Does that make sense? Okay, a lot of these early chapters are about like restructuring your mindset so that you're sort of leaving behind or checking at the door your modern materialist mindset. By materialism, I mean the idea that everything is just material, right? That there's no spirituality to reality. And as we go through these topics, I want you to understand that there are a variety of kinds of truth, and I don't mean that in some sort of um, postmodern, oh, that's your truth and that's your truth and that's your truth and we all have a relative truth. That's not what I mean. I mean that you can say something that might not be materially manifest, but it's still true, right? So, and there are examples of that will show up a lot of times in the Bible. Um, a good simple example that I can give of that is when Jesus says that Elijah comes before there was a video that mentioned this. Elijah comes before his coming and has come, right? That Elijah has come again, right? But then he says, um, John the Baptist is the Elijah that came, right? And so we wouldn't say that Jesus was being dishonest or that he was saying an untruth, right? He was saying a true thing, but it was a symbolic reality. It was a symbolic truth about what John the Baptist represents through the prophetic lens. Does that make sense? That's just one example of what it means to have, or if I say, if I am talking about, something going really fast and I say, that car flew by. I'm not really giving you I'm not lying to you. I'm using language, metaphorical language. So that's just an example of that. I'm not saying that maps 1-to-1 to what we're about to go through. I just want us to sort of get that in our mind, that things can be true, but might not necessarily always have a material. We, in our modern materialist world, elevate the material and lower the symbolic. I want you to reverse that. Prioritize the symbolic. Material is not as much what matters. It does matter, but what goes on in the material world, what that means to people, is more important to them than all of the very fine scientific details of that event. Does that make sense?
It kind of goes with the Bible, like the different versions of Bibles. They're either word for word
Mm-hmm.
or thought for thought.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you try to like King James word for word, like you said, like their metaphors or their examples.
That, yeah, it's really harder to discern.
And after you have your different versions where it's thought for thought, where it's into like our language and our metaphors.
Yeah. They're different translation sort of philosophies, they'll have different strengths. Word for word is awesome if you know a lot of Hebrew words. You know what I mean? Because then you can identify, oh, that word is going to be this, and I can see it show up. Whereas if you read the NLT, maybe like they didn't actually put a 1-to-1 word there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You can identify as the Hebrew word. But yeah.
Another example is the difference between brain and mind.
Yeah, that is a really good example. Does anyone know about the mind-body problem in philosophy? It's the idea of where does my
it's like psychophysical.
Yeah, where does my physical body end and my mind and like my mental reality, right? Like the thing that is animating my body, where does that begin, right? Because we have a physical brain, right? But like there seems to be something beyond that, right? And so, and in the Bible, we would say there is something beyond just my brain, right? So, yeah. Does that explain what you're talking about? Yeah. Yeah. So there is a physical correspondence to. Yeah, it doesn't. No. There. It describes a physical correspondence to a spiritual reality, like you could say to my brain. But our brain, ironically, this is where things get infinitely complex when it comes to science, and this is why it becomes almost like we put a stopper on any further conversation because of how infinitely complex science is our brain actually isn't the only thing controlling our state of being, our state of wellness. Our gut microbiome, you know what I mean? Like will control our hormone levels, you know what I mean? Like there's so many things, and it's our entire body at play with our brain that really will affect sort of who we are and our well-being. So if I talk about things in scientific way, I almost like am never able to give you the truth. Does that make sense? Because it's infinite complexity. Who knows what quarks are? I don't know what quarks are. You know what I mean? But who understands quantum physics? Nobody, as far as I'm concerned. But does that make sense? So when God is describing the creation of the world, for example, he's not describing quantum physics because he doesn't expect even us moderns to understand that. Does that make sense? Because we don't. These are the sorts of things we're going to be talking about today. Hopefully we won't get too bogged down. I don't want to talk about science that much in this class. but especially because I'm not a scientist. But yeah, and also because it often will distract from the meaning of the text. Does that make sense? Okay, let's get into today. So, I just want to take the opportunity to say like a disclaimer. I've already been giving a little bit of disclaimer, but there's a lot of tradition and cultural assumption, this heritage that is handed down to us that we find in our contemporary readings. A lot of things that are said about Genesis 1 to 11, just sort of on a baseline level in our sort of in our zeitgeist that will imbue our brains. Sort of like an example I could give is the idea, this is not really related to Genesis 1 and 11, but the idea of the devil as, having a pitchfork and horns. It's like this is something that we all sort of culturally assume, but we know is not really the case. You know what I mean? There's a lot of that in Genesis 1 to 11. Okay. And so we want to basically set aside history of interpretation, right? Things that people have said throughout history that maybe have shot us off in a weird direction in regard to Genesis 1:11. Does that make sense? What the goal is, or a perfect example of this is like the Tower of Babel, within Genesis 1 to 11. Like it didn't look like that. Um, if you look at the people in all these paintings, they look like Bohemian kings or something like that. You know what I mean? Like they don't look like Middle Eastern people of the ancient past. I guess that's the point that I'm trying to make. So in this study, our goals for interpreting these chapters will be number one, to rely on ancient Near Eastern cultural background and worldview as our frame for understanding. Does that make sense? Number two, utilize a comprehensive approach in regard to the Hebrew language. So looking at Hebrew words a lot. Okay. We spend a lot of time looking at Hebrew words so that you can kind of see what is actually being said in its original language. And recognize these chapters as the foundation. So these chapters are setting a pattern is the main point that flows through the entire story. I talked last week about the typology aspect. Who remembers that? Typology it means the science of a pattern, for example, and it's the pattern that is established in Genesis 1 to 11 that reaches to the end, even so far as in Genesis chapter 11, you have the Tower of Babel and the scattering of the nations. All the languages are confused. But then in Acts chapter 2, you have the ingathering of the nations. Everyone understands each other in their own language. So there's a reversal. So you have to, or I also mentioned that Peter, or the writer of Hebrews, refers to like the proto-baptism as Noah's Ark and the story of Noah's flood, right? That's a sort of precursor to baptism. So again, these things that happen in Genesis 1 to 11, they're a sort of universal starting point for everything that happens in the Bible. And they have all of these like links into the future. Okay. Does that make sense? And so understanding Genesis 1 to 11 really is it's everything to me, honestly. Like it's so important when it comes to Bible study, because most confusing questions of the future, they go back to, those problem passages that were like, I don't know what to do with this. Oftentimes the answer is found in a proper reading of Genesis 1 to 11. Does that make sense? Cool. So let's talk about ancient prehistory. Who knows what prehistory is? What is prehistory? Before it's written. Yeah. When a lot of times people think prehistory means like before time begins or something like that. That's not what we're talking about. History is a record of events, right? And prehistory is the events that happened before you keep records, right? And so there is human prehistory that predates any writing of human events. Welcome in. Are you here for the deep end?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, great. Okay. Awesome. Okay, great. So, Genesis is the name Genesis means origins. Okay. So we're talking about the origin of the world, of humanity, and the chosen people, right? The chosen nation of God. That's why the book of Genesis does not just include Genesis 1 to 11, and then it's over. So once we get to Exodus, we have to understand why are these people important. And so the rest of Genesis 13 to 50, is talking about the family that leads to the people of God, right? So just to kind of reiterate, Genesis 1 to 11, it's about the creation of the world, humanity pre-flood, the flood, then the re-emergence of humanity post-flood, and then the scattering of the nations. Whereas Genesis 12 through 50 is the call of Abraham. It's like we're talking about these epic narratives, right? Concerning all of society, all of humanity, right? And then we like zoom in on a family, right? On a husband and a wife who have no children and their family line, right? Does that make sense? So it's the origins of humanity and the world and society and all these things, and then the origins of a specific people. What I guess I'm trying to get at is you have to acknowledge that Genesis is writing prehistory. Does that make sense? So it's writing a prehistory narrative. So the things that you read in Genesis, the entire book of Genesis, even in regard to Abraham, it's writing essentially a prehistory tale just because it's retrospective. Does that make sense? So Genesis is written in about 1400 BC. You can say Genesis is finalized because it will go through some edits throughout its history up until like the last prophet, until the canon is finalized of the Old Testament. But Abraham lives 600 years before Moses lives. You see what I'm saying? So if Moses writes the ancestral tales, he's writing about at least pre-Israelite history, right? He's looking back. That doesn't mean that those stories didn't exist in their own formats prior. The point is that Genesis as its own composition doesn't exist until after Abraham, right? Until after these. So when you look at Genesis, Moses is writing the family history of the people of Israel. And when you're reading Genesis 1 to 11, you're reading the history of the world, prehistory, according to the Israelites. Does that make sense? So Genesis by nature was written retrospectively. This means that when we read in Genesis about the dawn of creation, humanity, human civilization, it's written from the point of view of someone living far after those events that are described, right? So if Moses is the writer of Genesis 1 to 11 example, he's looking back. That's not something that we should be concerned about. As we talked about at the beginning, there is a shared cultural heritage amongst all of the cultures of the ancient past that we'll talk about. Here are the most important things that we need to know about the world. Oftentimes, that ancient history is like the most significant event is the flood. And we'll talk about why that is. But they all sort of agree upon these things. And then the Israelites are going to frame it from their point of view in the scripture. Or I guess you could say the Holy Spirit, God, is framing it from his message, right? And as we talked about last week, the thing that we can have confidence in is Jesus who authenticates these stories, right? As I said, unless we are Jewish ourselves, this is, this isn't exactly the stories that were handed down to us. We had our own mythologies, right? And then someone came and said, Jesus said this about the world. So this is an aside and sidebar, and hopefully I don't get too distracted. But the Norse mythology, for example, about the creation of the world, if you open up that book, it starts with the biblical creation story. Why is that? It's because the writer, the preserver of the Norse mythology, his name was Snorri, in like the 1200s. He frames it as here's the creation narrative, and here's how the Norse got confused about the creation narrative. Does that make sense? Even though, he himself is a person living in those lands. And does that make sense, guys? So when we're talking about creation narratives, we're talking about basically agreed upon assumptions about the creation of the world, but disagreements on the details and what it all means. Does that make sense?
So cuneiform started in 32 BC,
Mm.
3200 BC.
Mm.
Was there anything in cuneiform about the Bible?
About the text of the Bible,
About
like
this
referring to
beginning of time and all of that.
Yeah. So in cuneiform, in like the Babylonian Sumerian
Right.
texts, you will have parallel stories.
Okay.
Yeah. Specifically about Genesis 1 to 11. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because I was looking at some of that and I thought
Mhm.
the writing starts then.
Yeah. Yeah. So there, but that's not when Moses lives, and Moses is like, for all intents and purposes, the first writer. Does that make sense? So even internally in the logic of the Bible, the first writer of the Bible, the first one who pens it, theoretically, is that Interstellar? I could tell by just the first few notes. Yeah. That's fine. That's fine. Alright. Yeah. Anyway. Genesis 1 to 11 is a prologue and account of the state of things, including the purposes of creation, the design and operations of the cosmos, how the universe works. Again, not even necessarily from a scientific perspective, but from a sort of, we'll get into what this word means, but from a phenomenological perspective, and we'll go over that. The various causes behind evil and suffering, so an explanation of why we are alive yet encountering these problems in the world, right? And how God plans to deliver his creation from those problems, right? How he plans to deliver a good yet corrupted universe, a good and corrupted world, okay? These chapters set the pattern. This is all things that I've said. They establish the frame for the whole biblical story. They are the cornerstone of the remaining narrative. Importantly, these chapters lay the foundation for the unique worldview of the ancient people. And this is what we're getting into today. The worldview. What is a worldview? A worldview is how people view the world. Okay.
Regardless, flat, instead of
Exactly. So how they saw the world, right? When they looked at the world, what did they see? Cognitive science will be quick to tell you that you will not see certain things if you don't know to look for them. Okay. And this is the truth. Whoever saw the video of like the people passing the basketball around? I think I showed it last time. There's a video that people will show in psychology classes of people passing a basketball around. And a gorilla walks through the frame and then walks out. But most people don't notice the gorilla, right? Because they don't know to look for it. It's not within their world. They think they're watching a video. They literally, like, it's telling you that your brain will play tricks on you. If you don't know to look for certain things, you're not going to see them. Your brain will actually filter it out. No signal in your brain will tell you that a gorilla walks through the frame naturally, unless you have the thought to identify it. People play this trick all the time on you. When, if you go to the circus and you go to a magic show. Yeah, exactly. So the idea here is that we want to have like the worldview of ancient people because we'll start seeing things differently in the text of the Bible and even in our own experience. Okay. So again, we're talking about prehistory. Genesis 1 to 11 deals with the age known as prehistory. Prehistory is a term for the record of time the time prior to recorded history, a time from which we have no surviving written records themselves. So you don't have a writing from Noah, right? Or Methuselah or things like that. We don't have surviving written records themselves, yet from which there has survived a collective consciousness, a collective memory about things that have happened in the ancient past, okay? And that's super important as we get into the Bible. So within all of the most ancient accounts of prehistory, there are certain fundamental shared features across all of them, okay? They are the following. So one is going to be the dawn of the world, right? So the explanation of how we got to where we are. Oftentimes, you don't get conceptions of the world that it like has always existed until like ancient Greece, for example, or ancient Athens. Like sometimes there are people who will think, or Aristotle will be like, I think the world has always existed. I'm pretty sure that was Aristotle, but yeah, ancient prehistory is always talking about the creation of the world. Number two, it's going to be talking about the origin of the great leaders of the world. Okay. Those who are in control and have power. How did they come to be in control and have power? And what gives them the right to have power? Right. So that is often something that is discussed in ancient writings about prehistory. And then the third and final thing is going to be the flood. Okay. a world-ending event that resets human civilization and sort of makes it so that humanity has a split in between sort of its timeline, right? This concept of pre-flood humanity is very, very significant for ancient people. That at one time, there were the glory days where things were awesome and we had these great godlike kings ruling over us, and then it all ended, and now we're in the common era. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? That's what a lot of these, and within that, a sort of longing for the past, right? A longing for the greatness of the past. Um, like the story of Atlantis sort of comes out of this concept. It's a much more modern story than we actually recognize, but that's a sort of mythological idea about this idea of a great civilization that was flooded, right? And so that's sort of what the Bible is getting at in Noah's flood as well. It's speaking into that narrative, okay, of this ancient past. But from God's point of view, from the perspective of the biblical writers, that glorious ancient past wasn't glorious. It was violent, right? It was bloody, right? And it was displeasing to the God of creation, okay? Any questions on this, guys? Are we following? Okay. Uh,
We have a glorious past, right?
we do. What are you getting at?
Let's talk about Eden.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's actually very significant. So the biblical authors will think of a glorious past pre the violent glorious past. You know what I mean? They think about like an even further back, more ancient state of humanity that was better than what the people of the world thought it could be. You know what I mean? When they have these kings ruling over them. So this is that cuneiform tablet. This is what I was talking about when in regards to how can you read that? How can anyone read that, right? So this is a Babylonian map. So if you watch the video, you will recognize this. But this is a map from actually the anti-Israelite culture. Like Israel and Babylon are enemies throughout the Bible. But this is a map from the Babylonian side of things talking about, and the cuneiform will tell you, this is where you go if you want to reach the wreckage of Noah's Ark. His name is Unapishtim in their parlance, right? But yeah, the idea here is that if you go up to this mountain, you will find the broken down ark. The mountain that they say is Uratu, right? Which in the Bible is communicated as Ararat, right? It's the same mountain. They even are referring to the same mountain. So it's this idea that the Babylonians agree about this ancient past. The ancient Hebrews are agreeing about this ancient past. They are disagreeing about the meaning that we're supposed to derive from this story. Okay. For the Babylonians, it's the gods got angry with us because we were being so loud and having such a great time, like that sort of concept. For the Israelites, it's the creator God was grieved at all of the human suffering and all of the weak and powerless being butchered by the powerful. Does that make sense? So they're talking about the same thing, but from two different perspectives. Right. Here's another example. So this is called the Sumerian Kings List. This is another set of cuneiform tablets from Sumeria. So not Babylonian, but same language. And again, it has sort of like a very definitive, 10 like kings from creation of the world to the flood, right? These 10 like mega important figures, the seventh of which was taken up into heaven, the final of which was chosen to survive the flood. Does that make sense, guys? It's called the Sumerian Kings List, and they share these traits. They share these examples of these great figures of the past that are super important, the seventh of which is taken up in heaven, the final of which is chosen to survive and does survive the flood. Okay? So this is another one of those cultures, not Babylonian, but Sumerian, a shared culture that shares this history with what you read in the Bible, okay? That they are agreeing upon these things, they're just disagreeing on the meaning, right? And what is the message? So the text of the Bible covers each of these topics for itself in the chapters of Genesis 1 to 11. Does that make sense? That's what we're trying to get at, is when you're reading Genesis 1 to 11, you are reading like, here's the agreed upon story of the ancient past, but from the Israelite perspective. Okay? Some people will be like, so you're saying the Bible isn't novel? Is that what you're saying? That's not what we're saying in like any negative sense. Does that make sense? If I talk about an event of the past in American history, I might have a different opinion than someone else. And if I'm inspired by God to write a scriptural understanding, a prophetic understanding of American history, you know what I mean? Then like I'm talking about a single event, but what's novel is the divine perspective, the perspective from the creator God. And the question is, why do we trust, and I keep going back to this point, why would we trust the biblical account over these other accounts in the details? Because Jesus is the one who authenticates this, you know, for all the nations, the Messiah comes and he gathers all the nations and he says, these are the scriptures that testify about me. Does that make sense? So the proof is in the resurrection, always. Even Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 will say, if Christ is not raised, all this is meaningless. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's talk about creation accounts, because we'll start at that starting point, because that will help us understand cosmology. Let's talk about creation accounts. What is a creation account?
Material world came to be.
How the material world came to be. Would it be more than that?
Yeah, because it's God bringing the material world into reality. So I guess it would say like, what is your, and I'm going to use a big word here, is your like epistemology for like describing creation?
Yeah, epistemology meaning how you know things.
Knowledge of reality.
Yeah.
So I would say as Christians, we have a theistic epistemology of that, and that a personal, all, mighty, powerful being brought the universe and matter into fruition, whereas it's not uncaused forces acting randomly.
Yeah, so I would say the biblical conception is not just material reality. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? So it's not just that he creates the material, he also creates the forces that order the material. You see what I'm saying? And he creates a spiritual realm. So a creation account is an explanation of how and why the universe came to be. Universe meaning everything that began to exist, right?
Do you think logic and math were created, or do you think those were eternally existing?
We'll get into this next week. When we talk about the identity of God, right? The identity of God and who God is in the biblical conception. Short answer to your question, logic is derived from logos. Logos in the Bible is eternal. It is God. It is the word. So, and math is derived from logic. So, but we'll get into that next week. Okay. So an explanation on how and why the universe came to be. Okay. That's what a creation account is. So I'm going to read for you, just because I'm probably sure everyone in here has not read this. I'm going to show you what a non-biblical creation account looks like. A non-biblical. So we all know in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Yeah, the earth was, without form and void. Darkness was over the face of the deep. Okay. Let's read from the Enuma Elis. This is the Babylonian creation account. Okay. So this is their account of the world. Again, when we talked about those three things that are in all of these ancient prehistory writings, right? All right, here we go. When on high the heaven had not been named, firm ground below had not been called by name, not but primordial Aspu, their begetter, and the demiurge Tiamat, she who bore them all, their waters commingling as a single body. So we'll stop there. Heaven and earth, heaven and ground, don't exist. They have not been named, right? The only thing is Aspu and Tiamat, their waters commingling as a single body. That would be fresh water and salt water. Okay? Aspu and Tiamat. And they beget heaven and earth. Aspu and Tiamat. Their waters commingling as a single body. No reed hut had been matted, no marshland had appeared, no gods whatever had been brought into being, uncalled by name, their destinies undetermined. It was then that the gods were formed within them. Formed within who? The waters, Tiamat and Aspu. Okay? The story will go on to talk about this primordial state of chaos, which is the waters. They give birth to these gods that emerge from the waters, and heaven and earth will emerge ultimately when those gods, namely Marduk, who is the chief god of Babylon, slays Tiamat, who is conceived of as a dragon, and creates heaven and earth, splitting Tiamat into heaven and earth. Okay? Does that make sense? Even the splitting there, you should identify correlation if you are familiar with Genesis 1. Is there a splitting in Genesis 1? Heavens and the earth, but there's a separating of the waters. God divided the waters between the waters from the waters, okay? So this is, so we want to notice the similarities and the differences with something like the biblical creation account. Heaven and earth, waters, splitting of waters. Those are the consistencies. What would be one of the differences? Yeah, a variety of gods. But more importantly, the gods are born. These forces,
Yeah, no gods were.
no gods were. All that existed was the primordial waters, right?
Is Aspu and Tiamat gods considered gods?
They're considered higher than gods,
Okay.
and not really personal. They're more like forces of chaos. Okay, does that make sense?
Like Big Bang.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're gonna get into that a little bit. Let's move on. So the universal starting point for all creation stories, including the Bible, is a primordial state of chaos, often conceived of as a void of deep waters, right? We'll talk more about this in Genesis 1, but we don't conceive of it as waters. We do conceive of the universal state as a void of what? What existed before creation besides God? Nothing.
No thing.
No thing. Yeah, nothing existed, right? So we don't have a symbol to describe nothing. We tend to not, like, because even if you imagine darkness, that's a thing, right? So like your imagination of darkness is a thing. You know what I mean? You have no concept of what nothing is. But the ancient people had a symbol for what that was. They conceived of it as waters, right? Because why is that? Because waters have no form. If you have a large body of water, there's no form to it. Does that make sense? It's almost like nothing is really existing there because it's just like it falls through your hands. You can't grab onto water, can't hold it. It's conceived of as nothing, right? In the ancient, and it's where you go to die, really. If you go into the water, you go to die. You can swim, but you can't swim for that long, you know. And you can't breathe. There's no air, breath, or spirit, right? So out of the waters, sky and land and their inhabitants, both divine and human, emerge out of those waters. Okay? So they come forth out of the state of chaos, right? Does that make sense? That's sort of the starting point for cosmology in the Bible. And really, any cosmology sort of has this idea of a void of nothing, a void of chaos, or a void of, the Bible uses the idea of wild and waste, or tohu vabohu, without form and void. Again, what the waters are without form, they're void of any sense, meaning, whatever. Okay? So stay tuned for more on these waters, okay? This is really important. And just to give you a little nugget, if waters represent chaos, meaninglessness, death and destruction, the idea is you don't want to go back to the waters. You don't want to think about the flood and what the flood represents. Think about Jesus walking on water. Okay? It's a symbol of him having mastery over death, right? And creation. Does that make sense? So this is super important if you're an ancient person. If you see a man walking on water. You know what I mean? Whoa. That must be God, right? God has so anyway. So we're going to talk about creation polemics. Polemic is when I'm looking at the same thing that you are, but I'm arguing with you about it. Okay? So in the pagan accounts, the world is born out of violent conflicts, a battle between chaos and order, right? So again, Marduk is going to take the chaos force of Tiamat, the dragon, conceived of as a dragon, slay it and create the heaven and the earth, right? The gods emerge from the waters. They emerge from the chaos and are subject to eternal cosmic forces, and govern aspects of the world, right? So the gods emerge, the god of the sun, the god of the sea, the god of the air, right? And they are these governing principles or these governing powers over the world, these individuals who might often be at conflict with one another, right? The gods are competitive, and humans are often created accidentally throughout their battle or intentionally as slaves to either entertain them or feed them. Okay. Um, the difference here is the biblical creation account, right? So as opposed to the world being born out of violent conflict, the world is created as an intentional act of a being which exists prior to and separate apart from the waters. So in the beginning, God, the state of the creation in Genesis 1 is God looks at the waters and chooses to do something with them. Whereas you don't have that in these pagan accounts, right? You have the co-waters of Aspu and Tiamat commingling as a body, and then the gods emerge out, right? So in the Bible, chaos or the waters is effortlessly subdued by the creator God who carefully and purposefully forms the cosmos. So again, in pagan accounts, the world is born out of conflict, out of a war. In the biblical creation account, God is joyfully making things, right? And saying it is good at the end of it. So creating it with intention and then approving of its existence, right? Living beings are lovingly created and given stewardship over the world. So humans are created and taught to rule, right? Given dominion over the creation. The stars and celestial creatures in the heavens, the humans over the animals on the earth. Does that make sense? Humans are the climax of creation. They are the image of God, which in pagan literature was what the king was called. But in the Bible, every human is an image, right? Is the one who is representing God, serving as a bridge between the heavenly abode and the physical manifestation. Okay? Does that make sense? So the Bible is familiar. The point is the Bible is familiar with other accounts and it rejects their premises, right? It actually gives a contrast point. Understand how similar ancient pagan accounts are to naturalist, modern atheist accounts, right? So naturalist, atheist accounts say the world is born out of random chance and probability, the result of no intention. So chaos, right? And that matter, that things emerge out of conflict, right? Atoms bounce off of each other, and random probability and natural selection brings about the world that we live in, right? The universe is subject to the laws of nature. These forces rule the world like the gods, and the natural world is inherently competitive, and humans achieve survival of the fittest by being apex predators. You can kind of see how they have a sort of neo-pagan mindset, right? This idea of they don't assume that there's spiritual reality, but their assumptions about how the world was made and the cosmology is very similar, right?
Are the chaos waters an unformed something?
Yeah, that's a really great
Or
question.
are they a description of nothing?
Yeah, that's such a good question. There will be people who argue that. And so for those who don't understand, he's asking, are the waters something that God creates and then forms, or do they represent nothing being created, right? I tend to lean on the side of there's something that God creates and then forms. That's my opinion. Especially because there are parts of the text that almost later on we'll talk about that like God was there before the waters. So like a
reference to the Big Bang.
yeah, like well,
An unformed something.
Yeah.
And kind of the opposite is true. It's like you got chaos waters,
Mhm.
and then I don't want to go into the science,
Uh-huh.
the whole thing about entropy.
Yeah.
You know, that things will naturally move towards chaos
Mm-hmm.
without energy.
Mm-hmm. Without things recomposing, without agents to recompose things. Yeah. Yeah. It's awesome. Yeah. We can get so far into the yeah. This is my comments about the deep end. Or to start. I gotcha. Yeah. This is when my comments about the deep end at the beginning become relevant. It's like I'm just like pulling you guys into that deep end, but it's your responsibility to swim, if that makes sense. Um, so the Genesis 1 is not the only creation account of the Bible. So I want us to interact a little bit. We're going to read the emboldened texts. Okay. So let's open up your Bibles. Can someone just holler if you're going to do it? Someone turn to Psalm 33 verses 6 through 9. Who's going to do that? Someone else do Proverbs 8, 22 through 31. Someone do Psalm 8, someone do Psalm 104, and someone do Job 38. So someone just pick and shout out which one you're doing.
Proverbs 8.
Okay, Proverbs 8, Psalm 8, Psalm 33,
Job.
Job, and we have one more, Psalm 104.
I'll do it.
104. Let's start with Psalm 33.
Okay. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth all their host. He gathers the waters of the sea as a heap. He puts the deeps in storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spoke and it came to be. He commanded and it stood firm.
Okay, good. So anything stand out from that in regards to the creation? It's referring to the creation, and it's referring to something specific. The word of the Lord and who spoke and the waters. Yeah. So there's another reference to it. Doesn't these things don't they don't these symbols they don't just show up in Genesis 1. They will be a recurring theme. Let's do Proverbs 8, 20, 22 through 31.
The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. I have been established from everlasting, from the beginning, before there was ever an earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no foundations abounding with water, before the mountains were settled, before the hills, I was brought forth. While as yet he had not made the earth, or the fields, or the primal dust of the world, when he prepared the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he established the clouds above, when he strengthened the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters would not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him as a master craftsman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and my delight was with the sons of men. Now therefore, listen to me, my children, for blessed.
I think you're good. Yeah.
Oh, 31.
Yeah, that's all right.
Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah. That's all right. Yeah, no, thank you, Milo. Famous Old Testament Trinitarian passage about this one who is with God in the beginning, the architect, things like that. Yeah, again, the waters show up there, right? And to answer your question, Bob, that was an example in Proverbs 8 where it's before there were no depths, before there were no waters, I was present with God. So I don't know. I just think that's an interesting thought. But yeah, the mention of the waters, the marking off of the waters and their boundaries for livable, for a habitable realm, right? Psalm chapter 8. Who was that? Okay.
O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. From the lips of children and infants you have ordained praise. Because of your enemies, to silence the foe and the avenger. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, the son of man that you care for him? You made him a little lower than the heavenly beings, and crowned him with glory and honor. You made him ruler over the works of your hands, put everything under his feet. All flocks and herds and the beasts of the field, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, all that swim in the paths of the seas. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name.
Awesome. So Yeah, bodies of water. This one is important, again, for describing what is the biblical um, understanding of the purpose of humanity, right? Um, they aren't created to feed the gods or out of an accident or to be the slaves of the gods. Humanity is created a little lower than the angels, but crowned with glory and honor to rule over the created realm. Does that make sense? So the purpose of humanity you can see is very significant. The design and intention of God when he creates humanity. What are we made for? That's important when because that will mirror 1-to-1 with Genesis 1, right? Psalm 104. Because it's kind of long, huh? Um, just go.
I'll start reading.
Yeah, and I'll tell you when we're good.
God, my soul, praise Yahweh. Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with majesty and splendor. He wraps himself in light as if it were a robe, spreading out the sky like a canopy, laying the beams of his palace on the waters above, making the clouds his chariot, walking on the wings of the wind, and making the winds his messengers, flames of fire his servants. He established the earth on its foundations. It will never be shaken. You covered it with the deep, as if it were a garment. The waters stood above the mountain. At your rebuke, the waters fled. At the sound of your thunder, they hurried away. Mountains rose and valleys sank to the place you established for them. You set a boundary they cannot cross. You will never cover the earth again. He causes the springs to gush into the valleys. They flow between the mountains. They supply water for every wild beast. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. The birds of the sky live beside the springs. They sing among the foliage. He waters the mountains from his palace. The earth is satisfied by the fruit of your labor.
You can stop there. So again, just another reference to those waters about God creating. In this passage, he talks. It's mostly a conversation about waters above, right? So we'll get into the cosmology of it, but there are conceived of as the chaos waters out of which the world is born, and then the water is turned into meaningful things because it is used to feed and hydrate all of the plants and the animals, and there's a beauty and majesty to it, right? Okay, finally, Job 38, verses 1-11.
Yeah, I got that one.
Yeah.
Okay, then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. He said, "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off the dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched and measured lines across it? On what where its footing set, or who laid its cornerstones? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. Who shut up the sea? Who shut up the sea behind the doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garments and wrapped it in thick darkness. When I fixed limits for it and set the doors and bars in place. When I said, "This far you may come and no further. Here's where your proud waves halt."
Was that the end?
Yeah.
Okay. So again, just try to contrast that with the pagan aspect. The Bible, when it's talking about the creation, will most often mention the waters. We just went through it. The reason for that is because, again, it's such a prominent cultural assumption about this state of chaos that in this sort of dawn of the worlds, this state of chaos that number one, the gods emerge out of, right? That they come out of this state of chaos, and it is through their violent conflict with the chaos that the world and all its features are created. Whereas in the Bible, it is a person who is intentionally saying, effortlessly, you to the chaos waters, you go here. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You go here, you don't come any further, right? And I will use you for my purposes, right? Just is radically different. And we'll get it more into this about the difference between the idea of God and the gods of the pagans next week about the identity of God and getting him right. Sorry, we're not, yeah, not next week, but the next week, the next meeting week. Anyway, yeah. Anyway, are you guys tracking with me on that? Questions about that? You guys seeing about the pattern, right? And what that pattern represents. The waters, they represent a state of chaos. They represent a state of disorder, and God orders a disordered realm, right?
We read from each different author, each different passage,
Mhm.
and they all had the same foundation.
Yeah.
They all had the same meaning behind it.
Absolutely.
They all agreed on the same.
Yeah, they all have the same idea and conception about what is happening at the creation.
This was written at different times, different stages.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So you could say David had the same conception as Moses and wanted to write about it for sure. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about the cosmology, okay? The cosmology of the ancient past. So this is where we're adapting our worldview. We already started with the waters, right? But we're going to go any further. We are going to go further. And if you get concerned or confused, just stop me and let's talk about it, okay? This is just stuff from last week. Remember that I talked about how mountains, they represent the realm of the gods, the realm of the divine beings, the realm where you go and you perform a sacrifice somewhere on that slope, and then you are able to enter into the realm of where God dwells. About how the sea is the opposite of that. The sea is where you go down. It's the lowest point. The mountain represents heaven. The sea represents the death and destruction, because that's where water runs. It goes down, down, down. And I talked about these symbols of this is what those are. Is it has to do with cosmology. Cosmology means an account or a science of the world. Okay, cosmos means the world, right, or the universe. So the design, ordering, and nature of how the universe is, right, how it's made, how it's ordered, and what is the hierarchy of that order. So yeah, I'll get into our modern cosmology in a minute. But so the Bible is presenting what scholars will call a three-tiered cosmos. 3 tiers. The cosmology of the ancient world included 3 main tiers or realms, which made up the totality of the cosmos. The entire universe is made up, or the created world is made up of these tiers: the skies, the land, and the land, okay? The underworld, right? And this shows up time and time again in the Bible. So Exodus chapter 20, you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. Okay? There's waters below the earth. Does everyone know that? Because if you dig really deep, spring starts sprouting up everywhere. Okay. So yeah, we'll get into it. At the name of Jesus, every knee will bow in heaven, on earth, and under the earth, right? 3 tiers. I've got another one for you. I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea and all that is in them, saying, to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be the praise and glory and power forever and ever. So John's vision of the last verse that we just looked at. So this is what the cosmos, this is like a rough making of what the world is conceived of in the ancient mindset. Okay. If you watched the video on cosmology, and for us, this looks silly, but it really shouldn't look silly to you. This is how the world is conceived of in the Bible. And so when biblical authors are talking about the creation, they're talking about a world like this. You can go and read. I'm not actually going to do this for the sake of time. I thought about doing it. I was going to do another go around and read. But if you want to go back and look at the slide and just cross-reference all of these passages, it will describe things like the throne room, which is above the dome of that separates the waters. It will talk about the waters above. You have the dome itself. In your Bible, it might translate to firmament or dome. The waters below, and the dragon, Leviathan, that swims within the waters, and the foundations of the earth, right? This is sort of the conception of sort of the creation model. of the Bible. Okay.
I'm getting the idea that underneath the sea is hell.
Yeah.
Oh, Sheol.
Sheol, yeah. No, really, really great point. So I'll just say it now, but we'll get into it more later. Yeah. So the idea here is that you bury your dead in the ground.
And the dragon.
Yeah, you bury your, people. I mean, you don't even have to bury them. They disintegrate, they decompose, and they turn to dust. And so they turn back into the earth and they go into the underworld. Yeah. So yeah, and there's so much to say about that, but we'll get into it. Yeah, as we go. Okay. So this is sort of how the cosmos is ordered throughout the Bible. Three important words here is rachia. This is the Hebrew term for a part of creation that we just don't conceive of. The rachia is considered a construct of a clear glass-like dome which divides the realm of created order from the waters. Okay, so that's going to be this dome here, and this dome is referred to multiple times throughout the Bible. Many times is the rachia again, or firmament will be the word.
Is the dome is what is mentioned in Genesis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the thing that is mentioned in Genesis that separates the waters from the waters. So God created a rachia, and it separates the waters above from the waters below. Yeah, and within that dome, creation lives, right? In later parts of the Bible, the rachia is said to be the foundation below the throne room. So the throne room of heaven is above the rachia. Yeah, there's a barrier between unhabitable chaos waters, but even within the chaos waters is the throne room. Something that I just want to point out, just as we talk about like modern science, I don't want to do this too often, but where's the sun, moon, and stars in this conception? They're inside the dome. So in our modern cosmology, the dome represents the universe. The rachia represents the thing that separates non-universe from universe. Does that make sense? So just something to think about that. Okay, other word is Shemaim. The Hebrew term for heavens is simply the Hebrew term for all of the space above your head. Okay, so in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, it means he created the sky and the sun, moon, and realm of the sun, moon, and stars, and things like that. Okay, so all the space above your head and the realm of existence above the land, the unseen realm, right? Things move up here that I can't see. My words are flying through the air towards you, and you can't see them, right? The wind moves the earth, things on the earth. It's the realm above your head, right?
Eric, when, like in Mark, where Jesus is baptized, it says, and heaven was torn open. Is that the dome that separating?
It's a good question.
Into
Yeah.
the
So
third heaven kind of thing?
there are times, yeah, the third heaven. Yeah, that's really an important question. The times in which it seems like the truly divine realm of the throne room is opened up, and you're seeing through reality to like beyond the physical universe or something like that, right? That happens often. Mount Sinai, anytime a prophet gets a prophetic vision of the throne room, yeah, it's this almost idea that like you're seeing beyond this realm, the realm of you're seeing like, yeah, I guess you could say the rachia is almost like a psychic barrier. You know what I mean? Is that what you're getting at? Like,
Well, I'm just trying to think of how they would still be referring to
the heavens opening
this
up.
whole idea.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because the windows of the heavens open up in the Noah story, and then the waters start coming through. You know what I mean? So there can be a time, I think, where the heavens rip open, the rachia rips open, and you see, obviously we're talking sort of symbolic, but anyway, go ahead.
Someone asked you, is there 3 levels of heaven?
Yeah, so this is in extra biblical literature, but it like sinks its way into some of the writings, like when Paul refers to the third heaven. There's the realm where the birds fly.
Okay.
There's the realm where the stars live. And then there's the throne room, which is called the heaven of heaven. Okay. Or the highest heaven. We'll get into this next week. But the Bible is clear that God takes up residence in the heaven of heaven, in the throne room. but he is not like contained there, right? That he is beyond heaven and earth.
So that in that view is the third heaven created then?
Yeah.
Part of the universe.
Yeah. That he constructs his throne room. Yeah. Yeah. In that concept.
So the sky is the first level of heaven.
The sky where, yeah, the birds fly. Then, yeah, if we're talking about if we're syncing it up to modern cosmology, space would be the second. And then the third would be beyond space, right?
Okay.
Yeah. C.S. Lewis had that conception too. Anyway. And then Eretz is going to be the word for land, earth, or country. It does not mean planet Earth, but it can. I guess you could say it can, but mostly it just means the space underneath your feet, right? So this is an art rendering of that, right? So ancient culture saw the world through a phenomenological lens, and I'll get into what that word means. Cosmology was understood through patterns of the world observed via your lived experience, right? Making descriptions of the world primarily spiritual, about the way that you saw and perceived the world with your own eyes. Well, it may be hard to grasp initially, the ancient cosmology of the Bible was most concerned with theological and spiritual meaning rather than mechanical or scientific explanation. Okay? This is most evident in ancient understandings regarding heaven and earth. In biblical cosmology, everything that goes up goes towards the heavens, and I'll explain why. Where the creator God lives at the very top in his heavenly temple. Humans come down, or they come up from the ground, they rise from the dust, right? And are meant to go upward toward their creator, right? But because of their act of sin, they return downward and turn back into dust. From dust you came, and because of your rebellion, to dust you shall return, right? Yes, that's right. Biblical cosmology, this is what's really important, guys, for us to understand. The Bible, I'm not saying we should never think that the Bible is lying to us, okay? Just because it doesn't have a scientific description, it's not lying to you, or it's not mistaken. It's not a mistaken view of reality. The biblical cosmology describes what you see and experience for yourself. This view of the world is beaten out of you at a young age. This is how you would think about the world if you didn't have someone telling you otherwise, right? So when you go outside, look up and down and all around you. When you discern the order of creation, what appears to you is something closely resembling what is described in the Bible. First of all, the world is divided between sky and land, heavens and earth, right? There are realms at the fringes of your experience that you cannot enter into, that you're not made for. These are the waters. You go into the waters, you die. And I mean, we landed a man on the moon, but like that's that's that is, well, yeah. Beside the point, we the point here is okay. I'll
Just say we've gone and just
we've gone in a plane. Yeah, with massive effort it takes to go into a plane. But that's like in the last 100 years, people are flying in planes. You know what I mean? Like that is like completely unheard of throughout all of human history. We can't go, and even our seafaring, technology has radically advanced. You know what I mean? It's very dangerous to go into the ocean, and we can't even delve into the depths, right? The ocean, the submarine, Titanic submarine that exploded, right? So there are realms that we cannot enter into. Light comes down from above and is provided by entities that are not the creator, because you can see them and they exist within our realm clearly. But they convey immense glory and power through what they provide for the earth. The birds are fit for the sky, sea creatures for the waters, animals for the land. I'm just explaining Genesis 1 to you. Do you see what I'm saying? And human beings are unique from all of these in that our ability to comprehend and contemplate our experiences and understand higher meaning is what equips us to properly rule as God's imagers, right? So we'll get more into what that means in Genesis 1. But I guess the point here is that I just outlined Genesis 1 to you through your own eyes. Does that make sense? Through your own eyes. This is what we call phenomenology, describing the world via a hierarchy of meaning that is apparent to your experience. Phenomenology, the science of experienced phenomenon, right? So describing the world based on how you see it. And that's how God would describe the world to ancient people. And that's how ancient people would describe the world. Okay? Does that make sense, guys? Phenomenology and directionality. The baseline assumption is the difference between up and down. That's sort of part of what forms this cosmology. Let me ask you, who has the most power, influence, and honor among these individuals?
Yeah, they're all the same.
They're all the same, right? Who has the most power, influence, and honor now? Well, when I made this, I didn't think I would be sitting on a stool. Even something as simple. Yeah. Even something as simple as standing on a chair affords a certain kind of power. From here, all eyes can see the one standing above the rest, and the one standing above the rest can see everyone else unobstructed. So when the Bible talks about God is on high, he can see everything. You know what I mean? It's using this language. And the Bible will sort of be tongue in cheek at times, like it doesn't actually think that God is necessarily located anywhere looking. He's omniscient, right? When we say God is on high, we're using this directional language to describe what it means. Like there's a meaning to that, right? That there's a certain kind of thing that is afforded to me just by being above all of you right now, like a head taller above every one of you. And God is like that to the infinite, right? Is the idea. Well, it seems pretty simple at first. Understanding the sense of directionality and hierarchy is super important for truly understanding what God is communicating in the Bible, right? Sky and land, below, above, low and high, body and spirit. Body comes out of the waters, it comes out of the dust, and it is imbued with the spirit, right? So the spirit brings up, things from the low point. The earth or the waters, it represents potential, whereas spirit represents authority. The word that comes from on high lands on the earth and brings up things. You see what I'm saying? The earth is changing, whereas the heavens are unchanging. This idea that you look up and you even see the stars and they move, but never apart from their courses, right? And the seen and the unseen, right? So does that make sense, guys? If you go up, you're going towards these higher realities. If you're going down, it's these base realities, right? Therefore, know this day and consider it in your heart that the Lord himself is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. So directionality. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts, right? What does it mean for a way and a thought to be higher? Is that a literal direction? It's but the idea here is that we're taking these sorts of concepts and and there's a meaning behind it that we can apply, right? So my ways are higher, they're elevated, right? Is what God is saying. Is God not in the heights of heaven and see the lofty stars, how high they are? So there's a correlation between you look up and you see that the stars are really far away, and God is even so far beyond that, right? That's another thing. We look out into the stars and we think that we're looking like outward. You know what I mean? Whereas in the ancient cosmology, you're looking upward, right? He delivers me from my enemies. You lift me up above those who rise against me. So this idea of, again, this is metaphorical language about being lifted higher than my enemies, right? That David is using. Thus says the Lord, remove the turban, take off the crown. Nothing shall remain the same. Exalt the lowly and bring low the high. You see how important this is going to be as we understand what is happening in the Bible, okay? Especially because the idea is that there's a reversal of these things, that low things that are considered shameful, right, are brought up, right? So God is glorified through his suffering on a cross, the most shameful death. You know what I mean? Like these ideas of directionality and hierarchy, things that are to be desired, things that are honorable, things that are good are high, but God will incarnate himself, make him low, go down into death, and come back up again. There's a collapsing of the hierarchy almost throughout the biblical narrative. The day of the Lord of hosts shall come upon everything proud and lofty, everything lifted up, and it shall be brought low. There again is that collapsing of that. I'm talking about. Our soul is bowed down to the dust. Our body clings to the ground. Again, dust and ground, the low place, this place of despair. I went down to the land whose bars closed over me forever, yet you brought me up from the pit. This is Jonah. So he goes down deep into the waters as he's swallowed by the fish or the whale or the dragon, and he comes up, right? He comes up again. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
Okay.
Even built into us, though, are like a universal sign of shame is to look down.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is our cognition. Even the idea that authority comes from above. Our eyes and our brain and our mouth, the thing that represents us, like I'm all looking at the top of you. Does that make sense? So, and this controls everything else, right? So anyway, there are some people who will take it so far as to say like your whole being is a dome, because if you take the shape, you know what I mean? It's like, anyway, there's a dome of the cranium of your head, and they go all sorts of directions with it. But any questions?
I don't know, I keep thinking too about when you baptize, how you submerge, how you submerge the sin, and you rise up as a new creature.
Yeah. Yeah. You can't really understand baptism to the full extent at which the Bible is presenting it to you until you understand what it means to go down into the waters willfully. Willfully.
Right.
That's the point. Willfully, I have been crucified with Christ, right? Paul says. So I went down into the waters. I went down to the land whose bars closed over me forever, and you brought my life up from the depths, from the pit, right? Baptism. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, up, down and up. Yeah. Really, really good. You guys are getting it. I can never escape from your spirit. I can never get away from your presence. If I go up to heaven, you are there. If I go down to the grave, you are there. Okay? Good. So back to the cosmology question. I'm going to go quickly through this since you guys, I think, are getting it. And if you're troubled, just let me know and we can talk about it. Obviously, the biblical cosmology is not equal to our modern cosmologies in that they are not saying the same thing, right? So modern cosmology is that you live on planet Earth, right? With the moon and the stars. So you are here. Your planet is part of a solar system, right? Other planets. That solar system and all the other solar systems make up a galaxy among billions of other galaxies, right? And that all makes up the physical universe, okay? Believe what you want about, whatever. The whole point here is that modern cosmology is not phenomenological like ancient cosmology. Instead, it is based off of hundreds of years of mathematical, geological, and astronomical understandings, right? And I'm going to skip this actually, just to get at the main point. So there's a major difference between phenomenology, and scientific observation. Who can guess what that difference is? I think you have one in particular, but if you have any idea, just shout it out. The major difference is there. Okay? So phenomenology is about seeing the world through your naked eye. Science is about changing your perspective completely in a way that is completely unnatural, right? Completely unnatural to how you are built. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying that we should not at all be anxious or surprised at the fact that things start to look radically different when we alter our point of view and try to understand in ways that are completely unnatural to our native human experience. Does that make sense? You're not meant to see DNA. How do I know that? Because you can't see it without something else. Your eye is not built to perceive DNA. It's not built to perceive radio waves or microbiology, right? Or planets, like, light years away. Does that make sense, guys? It's just not how our eyes see things. And so our conception of how the world looks, it will break down when we change our perspective. That's just the truth. And so the prophets did not employ modern scientific descriptions of the universe. They couldn't. Those descriptions did not exist. Okay? Their language is not equipped to describe to you the quantum realm. Their language is not equipped to describe to you nebulas. Does that make sense? And stars that are made out of however much, get certain types of gases or whatever, right? They're not equipped. And what good is it to you in your life to know those things if you're trying to figure out how to actually manage the world with meaning,
I
right?
think you used a metaphor before, like water.
Yeah. Is it H2O, or is it something that I use to hydrate myself and wash my clothes and hydrate my children? And exactly. That's a great example. There's a mechanical description of things that is less important, really. Does that make sense to your life? In the long run, it's important because we have great medical technology that can save us. We have cars and planes and all these things, right? That is built off of the mechanical sciences. So it has helped us to advance. But we have to understand that in the same way that we can comprehend how God chose specific languages to convey His message, we also should be able to understand that God chose a specific worldview, namely a worldview without these assumptions, right? The choice of God to reveal Himself through people ignorant of material sciences did not hinder His message. On the contrary, God working with ancient people is what has led to the progression of humanity so that we could live better lives through scientific discoveries. Does that make sense? Like, He dealt with the spiritual first, and these material goods have come because we have loved our neighbor. Does that make sense? Because we have loved God enough to investigate His creation, figure out how it works so that we can somehow build technologies that are helpful to us, right? Does that make sense, guys? All of the scientists of the scientific revolution, they were all Christians. They were all believing people. Do you follow me? They all said, we want to see the world for how God made it, and we want to discover how it's made so that we can appreciate the Creator more. Okay? So,
if you read the book, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made
mhm.
by Philip Yancey and Dr. Brown, it talks about how even the internal part of your body can talk about the universe and how God works,
Absolutely.
even in a smaller sense inside the body.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
It's very true. And that's another really important point to get at is that the description of the world is consistent. And I said that with the cosmology, how the sun, moon, and stars are inside the dome. You know what I mean? It's like, so if you did want to parallel one-to-one, everything beyond the universe, we would say, is either the void or it's where God lives. Just something to think about, right? This is a sidebar. I just wanted to frame for you how we got to where we are. When they conceived of the earth as round, just before the time of Jesus, the question is how are cosmologies developing? So this art here is going to show you. They conceived of the world therefore as spheres, that these planets exist. You can see Sol, Jupiter. It's all in Old English, right? Luna. So, and they're stars, right? But the world is conceived of as these planets or these stars embedded in spheres that are circling around the Earth, and the Earth is at the bottom. So when people talk about geocentric models, like the idea of like the Earth is the center of the universe or whatever, it actually wasn't the center of the universe; it was the lowest point. Does that make sense? Of a spherical cosmology. So you just take this and you just like blow it up, like, and and add a lot more stars into it. It's the same cosmology as we have today, except for the fact that the Earth goes around the sun. But even still, it's kind of like from where your perspective is. You know what I mean? So I'm sure you have questions about this. Does anyone have questions about what's going on here?
I was gonna say, I think it's interesting that there's like the negative, the evil in the center there, but then like
Hey, there you go. So that's going to be a dragon swallowing all of the souls in Sheol, right?
and then the other one it has the angels around the outside.
Yeah, here's the dragon again, right? But who's at the very top? There's Jesus, right? Yeah, and then here would be the 4 cherubim. Yeah, Ezekiel. So this is like 13th century cosmology. So again, you can just sort of see the progression. If I go back to the biblical cosmology, it's sort of like you take this and you just like go like that. You know what I mean? Just stretch it out so that it's like a donut. And then you just blow it up really, really big, and then you have the modern cosmology. Does that make sense? Okay. So just wanted to sort of show you guys how we got to where we are. And anyone know the hymn, This Is My Father's World, right? The music of the spheres. It's talking about those medieval spheres there's this idea that they made a sound that was sort of this divine sound. And anyway, medieval conceptions. We have 20 minutes left. And I think we're good on time. So how's everyone doing? Any questions about this stuff? Again, Bob is like a million questions. Yeah, I know. This is that deep end, like, oh, I'm scared. You know what I mean? I'm swimming in the deep end. Yeah. Just stop me if you guys feel, there will be some wackier moments as well, but this is helping frame for you the sort of how they saw those things. And again, I encourage you, the biblical cosmology is clearly evident if you just go look at those verses that I outlined. Also, ancient art depicts that. Like an Egyptian art, I'll show you next week. An Egyptian art of that cosmology. Of course, all of the different elements are gods, right? But it shows the dome and it shows the anyway. But yeah, you'll see that next week.
Something I was thinking about as you were going through it that I thought I just kept going back to it is how like when you think about the differences of like what the Bible is saying and what these other ways of thinking, I always go back to this idea of the interconnectedness. Like we're made in God's image, and this idea of like there's an African saying called Ubuntu, I am because we are. And there's like this interconnectedness. And then when you were showing the other, it was clear it was like the chaos, and it was almost like we're gonna attack you, we're gonna battle you, the competitiveness.
Yeah.
And so I just kept going back to that every time how it's just so clear. Like there's this, interconnectedness with us as human beings, and then, our ability to be like connected in a way that's deeper than just like
as the image of God.
Just this randomness that
Yeah.
anyways, that was
That there's meaning. Yeah, that we'll talk a lot about that actually next week. About not next week. 2 weeks from now. Next session we'll talk a lot about that, because the pagan assumption is that the world is made up of disparate competitive entities, right? Whereas the monotheistic, the Yahweh perspective is that God orders everything, and that everything is unified in his sort of sovereignty, right? So yeah, we'll talk a lot about that next week. Next 2 weeks. Sorry, go ahead.
I said God is intentional.
Yeah.
Everything that he creates and makes is for a reason, is for a purpose.
Right.
For the way the other people believe is like the spirits, but they don't have no purpose, really no meaning.
Yeah, oftentimes their purposes are self-serving. And 2 weeks from now we will talk about that. Thank you. All right. So I just want to talk a little bit about the difference between literalism and symbolism. Some people will really, really intensely read Genesis 1 very, very hyper literally. I mean, choose to do whatever. I think the point here is that you might deprive yourself of deeper meanings if you do that. Literalism refers to the interpretation of words in their most basic material sense. I actually hate the word literal, because that's not actually what it originally means. And this is why a lot of people get confused. Literal means it's attached to the word literally, or excuse me, literature, and it's the idea of what are the words saying. You know what I mean? What are the actual words saying? And it was actually an argument that was like against people doing like things that were not in the Bible, right? And they would say, well, what are the words? What is the literal reading of the words? You know what I mean? You should follow what the words actually say, right? But now we've taken it to mean what we tend to mean by literal today is we mean material. We mean material, right? So anyway, literalism refers to the interpretation of words in their most basic material sense, often having to do with mathematical, chemical, and mechanical measurements observed through our lenses. Literal thought primarily understands the world in relation to their physical reality, right? Symbolism refers to an understanding of words in their sense of meaning, dealing primarily with the spiritual and metaphysical reality, right? Symbolic thought is concerned with contemplation of layers of meaning found within language, ritual, and images that enlighten us to unseen realities, right? That we are able to contemplate the meaning of baptism, and it means something more than what is happening. Does it make sense? Notice also, just interestingly, you can never talk truly literally. That that actually is not a thing that we have the option to do, or truly materially, because these are all symbols, right? This is talking about material reality, but these are all symbols that we use to talk about material reality, right? So just something to think about, that even the material sciences, they're not devoid of symbolic descriptions. The way that they talk about the Big Bang, they talk about it technically symbolic, in a symbolic way. The way that they talk about quantum reality, it tends to be very symbolic. They're using representative terms to get you to understand something that isn't actually a description of what is actually always going on. So something to think about that. So symbolism in the Bible, I just a very, very clear and obvious use of symbolism in the Bible is an example from Jesus. When they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. Be careful, Jesus said to them. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They discussed this among themselves and said, it is because we didn't bring any bread that he sang this. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, you of little faith, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000, and how many basketfuls you gathered? How is it that you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread? Okay, so he brings up a discussion about yeast. He uses the word yeast, and then he's like, guys, I'm not talking about bread. Why don't you understand my symbolic use of these terms? Obviously, I would be able to create bread if we needed bread, is the point that he's making. Don't you remember that I created all this bread? I'm not like worried about bread. You know what I mean? Like, guys, like so the disciples are thinking he's saying, don't eat the Pharisee and Sadducees, don't eat their bread. And they're like, oh, we didn't bring any bread. What are we going to eat? He's like, I could create bread. I'm not talking to you about that. Okay. Be on your, but he does reassert himself. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He's like, I'll give you one more chance to understand. They understood he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but was against the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So there's an example, even in the Bible, of there being a misunderstanding on a symbolic level. And the writer is like, and then they came to the understanding of what he was talking about, So Jesus warns against the teaching of the Pharisees using yeast as a symbolic image, right? Here's an example of where I would say we need to read things literally, right? This is the coming of Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, to the disciples. And Thomas says, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were, I will not believe. A week later, the disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Jesus appears. He says, peace be with you. And Thomas puts his hand in the side. So Jesus invites Thomas to use his physical senses to literally materially observe the resurrected state by seeing and touching his crucifixion wounds. Okay. So here's an example where it's trying to be clear to you. Look at this thing that happened, right? Does that make sense, guys?
Mm-hmm.
So the material question of literalism asks, how does it work? What is it made of? What is the practical function of it in the world, right? The symbolic question is, what does it mean? Why does it exist? And what is the unseen truth that it embodies, right? Make sense? Another way of putting this is you can talk about the stool that I'm sitting on in chemical terms, in terms of physics and gravity, in terms of its light spectrum and coloration. None of that is telling you about why it is here in the room and that I'm sitting on it. Does that make sense, guys? Those are two totally different things. Okay. Here's a great quote from Oxford University mathematician John Lennox. He says, what would you think if I said to you, well, there are 2 explanations for a motor car. 1, the law of internal combustion, and 2, Henry Ford. You have to choose one or the other. So why do cars exist? Do they exist because of internal combustion or of Henry Ford? You choose, but you can't have the other. He would say that's absurd, right? That's absurd. Why? He gives another example. Why is the kettle boiling? Because the heat energy has got to such a stage that the molecules of the water are vibrating and they're spitting off steam, the pressure's building up, and the whistle's going. That's why it's boiling. No, it's not boiling because of that. It's boiling because I want a cup of tea. You see what I'm saying? So now you see there are two different kinds of explanation. There's the why, the meaning question, and then there's what is the physical thing that's happening, right? God is not the same kind of level of explanation as a scientific explanation. God is the reason there are any explanations at all. God is the meaning of the world, and he imbues the world with meaning. Does that make sense, guys?
Mm-hmm.
Questions? Questions?
Going back to your Thomas thing real quick.
Yeah.
Part you didn't read was the doors were locked and he came among them.
Yeah.
And then he's got this physical body that he can touch.
Mhm.
What is that?
That he eats food.
Right. But I'm saying,
Yeah.
so this body can somehow show up and
Yeah.
be physical.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the merging of the symbolic or the unseen with the material and the seen.
Well, or a new material.
Yeah, a new material is a good way of putting it. That's the whole story of the Bible is the unification, the exaltation of, or the glorification of God's creation into a state of heaven and earth being united, the powers and the authority of heaven being completely manifest on the earth, that the book of Revelation says there was no sea anymore. Okay? Does that make sense, guys? Isaiah says, in that day, the day of the Lord, God will slay the dragon of the sea. You know what I mean? So anyway, yeah. So the idea is he's not bound by his limitations as a human. He's fully resurrected and glorified, right? So last 10 minutes, I want to do an exercise with you guys, okay? How do we know which passages of the Bible should be read in predominantly literal terms and which one should be read in more symbolic terms, or perhaps even both overlapping at the same time? That's an important question, right? And I get this question often from different folk that I'm talking to is, okay, so what is the Bible trying to communicate to me?
Just like the perfect example, Sermon on the Mount, he speaks a lot in parables.
Yeah.
So that would be an example of, matter for matter, or taking away the meaning on what he's trying to describe.
Absolutely. I want to recall hermeneutics, that term from last week, refers to the interpretive frames that we apply to the text of Scripture in order to achieve a consistent methodology. One's hermeneutical lens for biblical interpretation might be philosophical, another might be cultural historical, another might be linguistic. Our hermeneutic will want to be the thing that informs our reading of the Bible, like making sure that we have a solid one. And that lens that we're putting on will help guide us, right? And what I've been trying to do is establish that hermeneutic for you guys. Cultural, historical, linguistic. You know what I mean? Like at some point you want to do sort of a mixture of different ones because, you want things to be philosophically consistent with the historical, cultural, and, things like that, logically consistent. But you also don't want to confuse yourself and think that you know more than you do, right? But remember that your Bible is a variety of genres, and that will also inform how you're reading and what lens you're wearing. Am I reading poetry? Then I will have the lens of poetry I'm reading poetry on. If I'm reading a historical report, the biography of Jesus, then I am putting on a different lens, right? So here's our exercise. Are you guys ready? I'm not going to provide any keys or answers. I want you guys to discuss, and we'll just end there. Does that make sense? So you're going to say, how should we interpret this? Literally, symbolically, metaphorically, what's going on, okay? So when King Azahiah of Judah saw this, he fled in the direction of Beth-Hagen. Jehu pursued him, saying, shoot him also. And they shot him in the chariot at the ascent to Gur, which is by Iblim. Then he fled to Megiddo and died there. Yeah. Literal? Anyone disagree with that? Okay. John 10. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And actually, let's not use the word literal. Let's use the word material. Okay.
symbolic.
I think both material and symbolic.
Explain.
Because materially, that is the function of the gate, the shepherd, the sheep. The sheep do hear.
He's
the
describing
voice.
a
He's describing a real thing, but then he's putting a bigger symbolic meaning of it. It's not just that material. It's symbolic.
You guys are awesome. This is what makes the Bible hard sometimes, is oftentimes it's both at the same time. You know what I mean? So only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful in my ministry. I have sent Tychicus to Ephesus. When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Capris at Troas, also the books, and above all the parchment.
Material.
Instructions to Timothy at the end of 2 Timothy. On the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. When they went in, they did not find the body. Explain.
Because it's both saying the actual thing that happened, but there's a bigger meaning behind the fact that they didn't find a body, that a stone had been rolled away. So they're saying material things, but they're helping you to understand that those material things shouldn't really happen. How and why did those things happen?
So there's so many things that you could say. It's I'll say it this way. The resurrection narrative is so precious in the Bible, so essential that, the connections are you know what I mean? So it's going to be connecting a lot of different things in that as well. So they are describing what happened as a report, but the way it's being written is also going to be giving us lots of great information, you know what I mean, about how this is the fulfillment of so much that came before it. So the meaning is not just simply an investigative report. It's the most important thing that ever happened. We're describing that to you. You know what I mean? It's gonna have everything, you know? So yes, it is, of course, materially a reality, but there's so much more to that, right? It's on a different level than bring the cloak and the parchments, right? Does that make sense? Then I saw between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders a lamb standing as if it had been slaughtered, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent into all the earth. Symbolic. It kind of sounds a little creepy if you try to draw it out, right? If you try to give an art depiction of this, it can be unsettling. This is supposed to be Jesus, of course, the man who was resurrected. So you can ask, what did John see? Did he see this thing, or is he describing Jesus, the man the actual man Jesus in heaven? You know, especially because there are other descriptions of this scene that use the Son of Man in language. You know what I mean? So there are multiple layers of meaning as we describe Jesus, right? And who he is and what he means. Okay? By the word of the Lord, the heavens were made, and all their host out of the breath of his mouth. He gathered the waters of the sea as in a bottle. He put the deeps in storehouses. The stars fought from heaven. From their courses, they fought against Sisera. The torrent Kishon swept them away. The onrushing torrent, the torrent Kishon, march on, my soul, with might. I'm not going to give you the answer. Sorry. I shouldn't. You guys say symbolic? Okay. Well, we'll save this for later. When John heard in prison what the Messiah was doing, he sent word by his disciples and said to them, "Are you the one who is to come, or are you to wait for another?" It's something that materially happened, yes, right? Kind of like the resurrection, there's so much imbued in that you kind of are just okay, but there's deeper meaning, you know? But yeah, there's I think the point here is that all of the symbolism, unless it's really just, again, specific, just very minute details, it's going to have higher meaning, right? These moments, especially, that are super important. There's going to be something higher that has a symbolic that there's something to it that is pointing to something else, right? And that it's representing something that's happening. Okay, this one is really unique, okay? And I want you guys to wrestle with this one, and this is the last one, okay? The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground, and now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand." Explain.
Because he did kill his brother, but the way it's worded is not what actually happened.
And Cain and Abel have to.
Because there's power in the blood.
That's great.
Blood is the lifeline.
Yeah. So is God saying that the blood is crying like tears or like wailing, right? Is that what he's trying to communicate? This is hard for me because I see God talking. And so he's disclosing things from his perspective. Is again, it's not wailing, but maybe is to God the blood actually crying out to him? You see what I'm saying? Like, this is what makes it challenging. You know what I mean? Anyway, I just think that that's really significant.
Kind of this and back to the other example of John's Revelation, or the Revelation of John. If you've ever had a vision or a dream, you're actually experiencing something.
Yeah, that's a really good
You're
point.
actually seeing something or hearing something. And it's like when at the beginning of Jeremiah, God says to Jeremiah, "What do you see?" He says, "I see an almond branch."
Mm-hmm.
And he goes on to tell him what that means. So oftentimes what happens in a vision or a dream is you actually experience seeing something or hearing something, and then God explains to you what that means.
Absolutely.
And
you really are seeing something.
And a lot of times the way he explains things is you just know.
Yeah.
Now you know what it is.
Absolutely.
So I'm just saying that he could see Jesus in this vision, in this revelation, and try to explain it, so to speak. But at the same time, he's also given information because the seven things are this.
Yeah.
So he's being told this is what it is.
Yeah, and he'll actually outline one-to-one correlations.
It sounds like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. That was the last one. Thank you guys for that exercise. We will just I'll just say reliable rules for discerning the literal or material and symbolic. Identify and understand genre conventions. So what genre of literature am I reading in the Bible? Recognize stylistic flourishes, the use of creative language. Consider the worldview assumptions of the ancient cultures. Use clear text to inform your reading of obscure ones. Utilize a consistent hermeneutic. My last slide, the essence of symbol. Far be it from us to ever think that the literal is somehow superior to the symbol. Symbols gather together layers of meaning that are often not obviously discovered in the literal, making them greater than simply the literal. So it's the opposite, right? Symbol elevates, right? It takes material things, it compiles them together and elevates them to a higher meaning. Think about baptism just as one example. Though the literal reality of baptism is merely a brief submersion of someone into a body of water, the spiritual and symbolic reality of baptism, of course, means so much more than what is happening. And I've already used that example today. In order to best understand the Bible and God's ultimate message to us, we need to embrace a deep appreciation for symbolism. We think of, just a symbol. I hate that term, just a symbol. Symbol is more than the literal, okay? God on the cross, God and Jesus on the cross, right? Physically happened, literally happened, but the meaning is greater than just what happened. Okay. Yeah, well, we're gonna get into that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, guys, thank you. We're not meeting next week. The next week we will meet, and we will be discussing the identity of God. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.